Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present at the symposium. I'm going to be talking about the Natural Science Collection Facility and its work to secure collections in South Africa. So what is the Natural Science Collection Facility? It's one of the Department of Science and Innovation's research infrastructure projects. It was launched as part of the South African Research Infrastructure Roadmap in 2017. And it's part of that program because the collections and specimen data are considered as research infrastructure. It's a network of institutions. At the moment, there's 17, including 10 museums, 3 universities, and 4 science councils. And there's a coordinating hub based at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So these institutions are scattered across the country in 6 of the provinces. And how the Nacf works: participating institutions must meet criteria for open access to specimens and data for research and decision-making. That was a requirement for becoming part of the South African Research Infrastructure Roadmap program. Each institution continues to be funded and managed in the same way that it was before. So the Nacf doesn't run these institutions, but the institutions agree to contribute to common objectives, and the Nacf provides support for achieving those objectives. And their multi-institutional decision-making, problem-solving, and planning structures, including a coordinating committee with representatives from the management of different institutions. And then there's also working groups for data collection management, staffing, and capacity development. So what collections are included? It's collections of preserved specimens of plants, animals, fungi, and fossils. So it's only preserved specimens, nothing living, no living tissues collections. And it includes a very wide range of different types of collections. So you can see some of them here, from fossils to fish to herbarium specimens, dried fungi, birds, bones and skeletons and skulls and pinned insects. So very diverse. And why was it established? So for many years, there have been calls from the research and the natural science community about the state of collections, the lack of resources, and the lack of a coordinating structure. And an assessment was was commissioned by the NRF in 2009 and published in 2011. And that showed that there were pockets of excellence, but that most institutions worked in isolation. And even within institutions, there was fragmentation with different collections operating independently. And there were no common standards or strategy, even within institutions, and there were no training programs. There were several orphan collections and many collections at high risk through neglect or poor facilities. And the importance of these collections was recognized as a record of species in the country. And these are critical for research in taxonomy. So that's just documenting and describing our biodiversity. Also for biogeography, so understanding distribution patterns and changes in these, evolution, and for conservation. And it's not just for research, but the specimen data are used for red list assessments and for spatial planning, for environmental impact assessments and development applications. So they have a very wide use and importance for biodiversity. So the goals of the Nacf, there are 5 main goals. The first one is about curating the collections and making these accessible. And then also upgrading specimen databases and making those accessible, an online virtual museum, services for identification of biological specimens, and also increasing the understanding of the value of collections. So I'm only going to be focusing on the first goal there, which is collections well curated and accessible for research. And since the Nacf was established and got its first grant, the initial focus was on addressing immediate risks. And so through the NSCF, funding was provided for collection upgrades. This included storage infrastructure and consumables, environmental control, including some fire suppression and detection, temperature, humidity control, and monitoring systems. So these were really just the most critically urgent, and those that were affordable. Couldn't be all 17 institutions, all collections completely upgraded. There was a limit to what was affordable. We also provided support for moving and integration of orphan collections and provided some assistance with dealing with backlogs in accessioning and curation. And then also over the last 3 years, we've focused on professionalizing collection management and curation. So it meant developing the standards and policy guidelines and procedure guidelines, and then also doing training, and those I'll be talking about more. And then now we're looking at the future activities, so doing an assessment again of the collections to look at the impact of the investment that's been made, and also using that information to plan for the next phase. So this just gives some idea of the support for collection upgrades. So there were lots of problems with the storage materials and with the bottles and shelves and boxes and plastics that were being used. And then also just the way the specimens were housed and organized. So we funded new shelving, compactors, cabinets. And then the support for orphan collections, just some details about that. We've facilitated through providing funding for packing, transport, and staff for integration of collections, including a big beetle collection from the University of Pretoria being moved to the Zico Museum in Cape Town, and then 4 different herbaria being integrated into the Buse Herbarium at UKZN on the Pietermaritzburg campus. A very big fish collection from the Albany Museum to the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity, both in Makanda, Grahamstown. And then we currently helping with the integration of Buffelskloof Private Herbarium to the Wits Moss Herbarium. And then the backlogs, so a lot of these institutions, researchers bring in large collections, or there have been donations, and the amount of work and the cost of the consumables for integrating those into the collections is often beyond institutions. So we've had 2 staff that we appointed, and they've just been working on the herpetology collection. So these are the reptile and amphibian collections, and they've been helping to integrate, rebottle, relabel, accession, and generally upgrade those unaccessioned specimens. And then we're also funding a documentation of a paleontology collection. So that's a faunal fossil collection from Sterkfontein, and that's through Wits University. Those are lots of actions around the collections in different institutions. But probably the biggest impact has been through the development of a manual, and that was a very collaborative and consultative process. It involved representatives from all the institutions, and they worked together to develop and publish this manual, the Collection Management and Conservation Manual. And the topics covered in there are accessioning, deaccessioning, collection documentation, access, collection care for fluid collections and for dry collections, and then also health and safety in collections, risk and disaster management specifically for collections, and then also ethics and permitting. This is a large document. It's about 350 pages, and the hard copies were published. So this is just some pictures of the working group, and that was also a developmental process because they met physically until the lockdown happened, and they met at different institutions, and that gave them an opportunity to see different curation practices and different kinds of collections, and to learn from each other. And then the published hard copy manual, we published about 250 copies, and those were distributed to staff at the institutions across the country, and that was during lockdown, so in March last year. So the manual includes policy guidelines, so we can't enforce policy, but we can provide guidelines for policy. We can document procedures also to serve as a guideline, and then also set standards that are expected for curation. And the manual also includes templates for various kinds of forms, whether it's access request forms, risk assessment forms, incident recording forms, so a whole lot of different forms. So once we had that manual published, we moved on to looking at training, and we recognize that there's no formal training programs for natural science collection curation in South Africa. Most of the staff employed in these collections learn from other staff who learn from other staff, and so there's no professional standards in this approach. Many of the staff have no mentoring, so their predecessors left already, and then they come in and there's nothing documented on how to do anything, and they just figure things out, or they do nothing, or they do what they think is right. And that's the current situation. So the course, it's been a virtual course, and it's aligned with the manual. It's been a series of webinars. There've been 13 so far. And then on each topic, there's a webinar, and there's also a discussion forum, and that includes presentations by staff from different institutions. And it's much more of a detailed hands-on how to do things in different kinds of collections. And then there are also assignments set, and these are aligned with implementation of the manual. So the assignments, it's actually an action that's needed to implement the manual. So it might be developing a workflow, or developing a policy, or doing a risk assessment, or doing a health and safety assessment for the collection. So it's those kinds of assignments that have to be done and submitted. And we've also had a series of tutorials on the assignments to provide additional support. So the course has been open to all staff, not only in the participating institutions, but to anybody who's interested. They've had to register. And initially there were about 74 people who'd registered. There has been some attrition in registrations. I think quite a few of the participants had just found it quite a lot of work on top of their normal jobs. But even having the manual and having training courses doesn't mean that there's implementation and that standards and everything just gets addressed within institutions. We've realized that implementation across the institutions is patchy. So even within one institution, one collection staff might have implemented some aspects, others nothing, others different aspects. So it is very patchy. Some institutions delegated implementation to one or two staff, and that really can't have the necessary impact. And some institutions have done random actions, so it hasn't been in a systematic way, and some have done nothing. And transformation and change is really what's needed to ensure that we achieve upgrading of the collections and professionalizing the practices. It's a change in very deeply entrenched cultures and practices that's required. So some of these institutions have been one has been going for 200 years, and trying to change those practices is very difficult. We have had expert facilitators, consultants who've been helping us for 4 years. So it's been a long process. It's not a quick 3-day workshop. And they've been helping us with transformation and organizational development. And we've recognized that it's a long, slow, and difficult process. So it's not just about curation, it's about culture overall and practices. And we've had sessions, immersive sessions with leadership, and that has some success. Some leaders participate, but they don't take back what they've learned into their own institutions and in their own practice. We've had community building. So what we've recognized is that this really, to have a network that is sustainable and is real and functions like a proper network, you need to build a community. And we've done that through having 3 forums. One was virtual, the other 2 were physical, and that's for all the staff. About 150 staff from the different institutions participate. We've got a WhatsApp group for all the staff to share whatever they want to share. And we've also got a Facebook page. And we've also had hub team sessions. So the hub team are the coordinating hub. And it's been a lot of learning about what change is, about what leadership is, and what transformation means. So there's been a lot of work, but what we've recognized is that there's still a need to work directly with the staff in the institutions. And that's to provide them with more support for planning and for implementation. So often they are still working on their own and feel isolated and a bit lost. And there needs to be a much more kind of holistic approach to curation, planning, so identifying what needs to be done and having a plan and building that into staff's work plans. So this whole process of transforming from a fragmented collections, fragmented institutions working in isolation and individual decision-making to a situation where we have a sustainable and dynamic network, where everyone's working towards common goals and standards, where we have professional practices, where we work together, and where there's always active learning, is a challenge. And our next step is an assessment of the collections. And we've established this as an initiative of the Natural Science Collection Facility. And we've said that it'll be a facilitated self-assessment process. So it'll be a self-assessment, but there'll also be moderation and sort of support while staff are doing that assessment. So it's not left, so that there is some credibility to the data that come in. And we really want to have a learning and developmental approach rather than an audit approach, because I think that'll be much more beneficial in the long term. And once we have the results from this assessment, we'll work in institutions with all staff to institutionalize the policy, procedures, and standards. So all of the resources are online. So the NACF has a website, and the manual is there as a PDF that can be downloaded. All the webinars from the course are there. And all the presentations are also there. The assignments are there, and the tutorials are also all accessible on the website. And I think I'll end there. Thank you. Thanks to the organizers of the symposium, and thank you to our funders, the Department of Science and Innovation.